All right, since the US President Donald Trump decided to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital last week, the entire Middle East appears to be on the verge of bursting into flames. There have been deadly protests from Palestine to Yemen since Trump's announcement, with the latest demonstrations we're showing you there in Morocco, Malaysia and Turkey overnight. Well, the Palestinian president's expected to reject an invitation to meet Donald Trump in Washington. It comes after he refused talks with the US Vice President Mike Pence when he visits the region later this month. Well, adding to a global chorus of voices condemning Trump's unilateral move, earlier the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan accused the US of becoming a blood partner. Well, meanwhile, amid the backdrop of an ongoing crisis in Jerusalem, Russia's leader Vladimir Putin kicked off an historic visit to Turkey and Egypt. Today on the France 24 debate, we asked, could Russia take a leading role in peace negotiations in the Middle East? This as that the US's role appears to recede in the region. Is Moscow now the key arbiter that needs to be consulted on Middle East debates? Well, joining us on the France 24 debate is General Dominique Trinquant, former head of the French military mission to the UN.
Good evening.
Thanks for joining us. Noor O'Day is the former spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority. From Jerusalem, Eugene Kontorovich from the Collet Policy Forum is also with us. And Greg Karlstrom is author of How Long Will Israel Survive? The Threat from Within. Thank you all for joining us on the France 24 debate. Let's take a quick listen to the Russian President Vladimir Putin speaking earlier.
Both of our countries are for the fastest restoration of a direct Israeli-Palestinian dialogue on all disputed questions, including the status of Jerusalem. And of course, these agreements should correspond with the decisions that have been taken earlier by the international community.
All right, General Trinquant, let's start with you. You're in the studio with us. Russia's profile has dramatically raised, if you will, in the Middle East since 2015, notably with that intervention in Syria. Could they be the key, essentially, to moving negotiations between Israel and Palestine forward?
Yes, Russia has certainly changed completely the picture in Middle East since the deployment of Russian forces in Syria, and then the process had in Astana, which is complementary from the UN process in Geneva. So really, Russia is currently in the center of discussion, at least in Syria. And we know that the process in Syria is of major importance in all the Middle East. And that's why today Mr. Putin, after visiting his troop in Syria, then flying from Turkey to Egypt, is showing that he has a major place in the future of Middle East.
So if we bring you in, Noor O'Day, former spokesperson of the Palestinian Authority, we did see Russia's president today declaring victory, if you will, in Syria, saying, you know, we're going to withdraw or partially withdraw some of our troops. Could we see Russia, the same question to you, edging in on this Palestinian-Israel conflict?
Well, Russia is no stranger to this conflict. Russia recognizes the state of Palestine on the territory occupied in 1967, including, of course, East Jerusalem as the capital. And Russia has been a player in the region for a very long time, more so, as we heard from your previous guest, because of its role in Syria. But I think from a Palestinian perspective, the change that the Palestinians are hoping for is not replacing one superpower with another, but rather depending on a more multilateral approach, something like the Quartet plus, or some sort of arrangement that includes several actors, including very importantly, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, also the European Union, important players like France, who have a very deep understanding of the issues, who have very good relations with both sides, and who can play a constructive role if Israel diminishes its belligerent attitude towards peace process mediation and what is required as far as Israel is concerned to strike a deal. Because right now, what Netanyahu is talking about and the peace that he envisions is no peace at all, and so it's a non-starter for any power that hopes to mediate peace.
We'll talk more about Benjamin Netanyahu as you made reference to him there, Noor, because essentially he's been in Brussels today. We will have a look at that. Let's bring on the question of Russia and the role essentially that it can play. If we come to you, Eugene Kontrovich, what do you think about that? Is Russia the hope, as you will, or the body that's needed to move this debate forward?
Russia has absolutely no serious or credible role in this matter. Russia is currently a country that is occupying the territory of two of its neighbors. It's annexed Crimea. It's fighting in a war of aggression in eastern Ukraine, and this after taking parts of Georgia. I think it's a bit ridiculous and almost insulting and fanciful to suggest that this country, an occupying power under European sanctions, can have any legitimacy in guaranteeing security in this region. Now, of course, the Palestinians would probably love to see Russia more involved, as Abbas got his PhD in Holocaust denial from Patrice Lumumba University. But a serious role for Russia, I think, can't be imagined. America is still the indispensable actor, and I think after everything quiets down, America will be seen to have gotten greater credibility here, because America is the first country to make it clear to the Palestinians that if you keep saying no to deals, the offers aren't going to be getting better, they're only going to get worse. And you can't have a deal if the Palestinians know that.
Did you want to respond to that?
Well, I think it's almost hilarious that someone from Israel is talking about an occupying power not having legitimate standing as a broker in Middle East peace. Israel is the occupying power in Palestine. The entire international community considers it the occupying power of Palestine, including East Jerusalem. Israel is a belligerent military occupation. It has absolutely no regard for international law, and its violations are well documented by international agencies. Having said that, resorting to twisting facts and twisting realities and dealing with alternative facts, I know that's very popular with the American president, but that should not have merit in any serious discussion like the one we're having here. The fact is, the Israeli prime minister, this Israeli government, this right-wing Israeli government, has absolutely no interest in peace, because the requirement for peace is ending the occupation, is respecting international law and respecting Palestinian national rights for self-determination. That includes self-determination over occupied East Jerusalem, as we heard from 14 out of 15 United Nations Security Council members just a few days ago. Unless Netanyahu thinks or envisions that there will be a Palestinian leader who will adopt Zionist narrative and adopt the Zionist perspective and suddenly surrender and abdicate claim to the legitimate national rights of the Palestinian people, I'm not sure exactly what kind of offer that your guest is talking about. Right now, this Israeli government has absolutely no interest in a peace deal because it does not want to end the occupation. It is investing in this occupation.
Greg Colston, you're the author of How Long Will Israel Survive? Thanks for joining us. What do you think about this? I mean, this wouldn't be the first time that Russia's shown interest in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We remember back in September 2016 when President Putin had tried to organise a summit between the two leaders, the President Abbas and equally Netanyahu. That didn't go ahead. There were too many issues. Could they play a role now, given the fact that the US appears to be rejected and out of the picture increasingly?
Well, I think the question is why Russia would want to get involved, why Vladimir Putin would see a role for himself in this conflict. I think you look at what Russia has done in the Middle East recently. In Syria, they got involved because they have strategic interests there, because Assad is a close ally they wanted to prop up, because they have access to a port in Tartus. In Egypt, similarly, they're getting involved because they want to have access to military bases, access to air bases in Egypt, and they want to sell weapons in Egypt. Why Putin would want to get involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a bit of a mystery. He already has close relations with the Israelis, with Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. He really, to be honest, has no strategic interests in drawing closer to the Palestinians. So why he would want to get involved in this conflict that has dragged on for decades, that I can't imagine he thinks he can broker an end to, or anyone can broker an end to at this point. I don't see why he would want to wade into this.
Okay, General Trankel, let me bring you in on this. Do you see it the same way? Is essentially this all about strategic interest for Russia?
Of course, it's strategic interest for Russia, but it's also a stabilization effect in the region. By solving, I mean, it's not already solved, but by stabilizing the situation in Syria, since its first appearance on the ground with its forces, then Russia has stabilized the situation in Syria, and we know the effect of Syria on Lebanon and on Israel. So it's a stabilization effect. What is very sad is that, in fact, a big power like Russia and US should enter the process from outside and not from inside. And currently we see the fight between Palestine and Israel, and how can President Trump and the U.S. be a stabilization effect in this region when it takes such a position? The position in the Security Council, which was very clearly stated, is that you've got Jerusalem is the capital for two different countries, for Palestine and for Israel. And now it just openly said that it's the capital for Israel. So we must go back to the table. But the problem is that the Palestinian and the Israeli government are not able to talk together. And they are the first players in this problem.
I mean, Greg Karlstrom, if we come back to you, General Trankel there spoke about the US essentially taking sides in this. Is that the way you see things? And for you, can the US be a credible mediator in this conflict?
Well, I think the question is not so much how I see the U.S. as how the parties to this conflict see the U.S. And I think certainly on the Palestinian side, for decades now, the U.S. has not been seen as an honest broker. It's been seen as taking the Israeli side. And so I think this decision that President Trump announced last week, first of all, it's quite symbolic. The U.S. Embassy has not moved to Jerusalem yet. It is not going to move to Jerusalem for a number of years because there's a whole host of logistical issues that have to get worked out. So in one sense, nothing on the ground has changed. Nothing concrete has changed there yet. And I think certainly from the Palestinian perspective, this just reaffirms what many of them have believed for decades now, which is that the U.S. is not an honest broker in this conflict. We heard Nikki Haley, the American ambassador at the United Nations, in an interview yesterday with American media saying that by making this decision, President Trump has taken Jerusalem off the table in negotiations. He's effectively said that Jerusalem is Israeli and not Palestinian. Now, the president has said different things, but for someone like Nikki Haley, for a top U.S. envoy at the United Nations to come out and essentially say we have prejudged the status of Jerusalem, again, I think Palestinians will look at that and they will say the U.S. cannot possibly have a role, and this just reaffirms what we've been saying for a long time.
Eugene Kondrovich, what do you think about this? I mean, in terms of the U.S. taking a side in this conflict?
I certainly don't think this is about taking sides. Any kind of diplomacy that's realistic has to be based in reality. And the reality is, as everybody knows but pretends not to know, is Jerusalem is in fact the capital of Israel. I'm sitting half a kilometer from the Knesset. There's absolutely no question. This is the capital of Jerusalem, of Israel. And the world has pretended to not know that, though they do in fact know it. And a diplomacy that's based in fantasy has no chance of success. And I think President Trump is saying we can't, pretend, we can't make believe anymore, and he's calling out that the emperor has no clothes. This actually restores U.S. credibility because, first of all, he's fulfilling a promise, even though that promise is not popular. Noor, thank you for your laughter. Let me just make a final point here. The Palestinians so far have been shown one thing: they can say no, 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 and the pressure will only mount on Israel. Trump is breaking that cycle, and that is indeed why the Palestinians have continued to say no.
Okay, you say Trump is breaking a cycle. You say Trump's breaking a cycle. Noura, did you want to respond to that?
Well, Trump is basically unraveling the international system as we know it. He's not, he's not recognizing reality. He's recognizing the outcome of a belligerent occupation. One of the most important tenets of the UN Charter is that no country is allowed to acquire land by force. No country is allowed to annex territory by force. That's exactly what Israel did in 1967 after it occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as the Gaza Strip. It illegally annexed East Jerusalem, and it declared it part of its capital. That is not reality. That is the outcome of belligerence and illegality. What Donald Trump did is hand out a reward to belligerence and violation of international law. He basically sent out a message to countries like Israel that they will be rewarded for this kind of behavior, the kind of behavior that international law says should be confronted and stopped. And I think that's why the international community is so concerned. It's not just because they have a unanimous position on Jerusalem and the fact that they don't recognize Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem because the international community actually respects international law. Well, the U.S. can stand all by itself for some time, good for you. That does not change the facts of the world. It does not change the balance of the universe, nor will it change the fact that international law is very clear on how it defines what Israeli actions are. So back to reality, the world is concerned because what Trump is doing is destabilizing the international system and order. He's changing the rules. He's actually destroying the rules without setting any rules. And he's saying that the U.S., because it is so powerful, it can do whatever it wants. It can prejudge negotiations and still bully its way as a forced arbitrator.
When President Trump made this announcement last week, when President Trump made this announcement last week, he spoke about an intention for peace and still essentially being in favour and support of the two-state solution. I'm being told that we need to hold this. We'll take a short break, but we'll come back and pick right up. Welcome if you've just joined us. We're talking about the wider debate of President Donald Trump's decision to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Before we went to a break, Noor, you'd made a comment about President Trump changing the rules. I know, General Trinquant, you wanted to respond to that.
Yes, I think that's the only positive point, is that President Trump wants to change the rules. And we've had a discussion for years about this problem of Palestine and Israel, and no real plan for that. So I think that changing the rule can be interesting. My only problem is that I don't see the plan. After changing the rule, you need to go for a plan. I don't see the plan. Second point is that I think that this position really unified the whole Muslim world against Israel and against United States. So I think that it will be very difficult to have another plan after this announcement, or it must be a very bright plan, and I don't see this plan.
I mean, General Trinquant raises a good point. What is the plan here? And that's that question to our panel. I mean, we know that Jared Kushner supposedly has spoken about being able to solve the Middle East crisis, but it remains ambiguous. What is that plan, and where does it go from here?
I think it's important to point out that there have been decades of plans for peace in this region based on the supposed two-state solution. And it's become almost like a religion. Despite decades of empirical failure, decades of only leading to more conflict, it's the only dogma that people know. And Trump is saying, why should I continue to put all my money on something that has continued to not work? So I think he's ready to think out of the box, and in particular, he's ready to create a new dynamic. It used to be thought, if the Palestinians say no, Israel has to come back with a better offer. Now the Palestinians know, if they say no, their next offer is worse. And they're going to be kicking and screaming about this, but once they digest it, it's going to create a really new dynamic.
Greg Karlstrom, it could be worse?
Wow.
I think to build on what Eugene said, there have been decades of talks. We've had 25 years of talks toward a two-state solution. And I think when we talk about the peace process now, there's this misguided focus on the process and on trying to get the language exactly right. And if we can tweak a few things here and there, get the two sides back to the table, we'll find a way to a deal. The problem is not what's in the deal. The problem is not the details of a two-state solution, because we know by now what the outline of a solution looks like. You could stop a taxi driver on the street in Jerusalem, and he could probably tell you in great detail what the two-state solution would have to look like. The problem is having governments on both sides that have the political will and the legitimacy to make a deal, to implement a two-state solution. And I think Nothing has changed now from when President Obama was in office to when President Trump is in office. We still have a very right-wing Israeli government in which the settler movement is quite powerful. We still have a very divided and stagnant Palestinian government with two different authorities still in power in the West Bank and Gaza, neither of which have much in the way of legitimacy. So I think, regardless of who the American president is, to look at the realities on the ground in Israel and Palestine, and to think that these domestic politics lend themselves to making a deal, I think is deluded.
But the American president to date has not given any clear direction about where this is going. For the moment, it looks as though it's resting on the shoulders of Jared Kushner, a 36-year-old. I mean, is that a credible option?
I think it's a lot better
we'll have to wait and see what
on the shoulders of people who've struck out for decades. But also, diplomacy shouldn't be conducted in public. The fact that President Trump is not waving around a plan is probably wise, because once you go public with a plan, it becomes subject to attack.
What do you make of that, Noura? No explicit plan is a good thing?
Well, I mean, if Trump is planning to sell his big plan the way he sold his steak and his wine, and we know how that business went, then I think the entire Middle East is in deep trouble. Listen, the Palestinians have their own internal problems that is not up for debate. However, on the issue of Jerusalem, they are divided. On the issue of who has the right to negotiate on their behalf, they've also come to an agreement. And I would invite Greg to update his information on where Palestinian reconciliation is, despite all the bumps on the road. As far as politics is concerned, Hamas, Fatah, and all the political factions are in agreement that the PLO is the only legitimate representative, and it is empowered to reach a deal. The Palestinians are not asking for the moon, and as far as the mentality of the bully that I just heard a little while ago about what Palestinians need to learn, I don't think this is a way to start a conversation. I do agree with the general that changing the rules can be interesting and good, but only if you know what you're replacing them with, and only if you're replacing them with something that actually makes sense. If you're changing the rules that say that countries need to abide by the law to a situation where bullies get away with bullying, then that is not, the way to draw any kind of bright prospect. The two-state solution is the international solution. It provides Palestinians with the minimum justice that they are afforded under international law: self-determination, independence, and sovereignty over 22% of historical Palestine. It is not up to the occupying power to decide what and when the Palestinians can get what is rightfully theirs. That is an international responsibility. What Trump has done is say that, there's a stronger party in this equation. I side with that party. I'm going to create a team around me of ideologues and people whose leanings and loyalties are very clear, and they are one-sided, not anywhere near balanced. They lack the competence, they lack the experience, and I'm going to sell you this idea of a big deal, of the ultimate deal of the Middle East, without really presenting anything. Nothing concrete has been presented.
Let's move forward. Let's move forward with this question, because in link with what you're saying, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has, of course, praised this move, saying that it's always been the capital. Today, in the first visit by an Israeli Prime Minister to Brussels in 20 years, Netanyahu urged the EU to follow in America's footsteps and recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The EU ministers have, for the most part, shook their heads at Trump's move. The 28-member bloc, though, isn't unified on the issue. Hungary, Greece, Lithuania and the Czech Republic favouring warmer ties with Israel. France 24's Ivana Skotola reports.
Again welcoming the US's announcement. On a visit to Brussels on Monday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he expected European countries to follow the US in recognising Jerusalem as Israel's capital.
I believe that all or most of the European countries will move their embassies to Jerusalem, recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and engage robustly with us for security, prosperity, and peace.
But EU policy chief Federica Mogherini repeated that the EU's stance on the matter is unchanged.
The only realistic solution to the conflict between Israel and Palestine is based on two states, with Jerusalem as the capital of both. This is our consolidated position, and we will continue to respect the international consensus on Jerusalem.
However, EU countries themselves are divided on what their exact stance should be, with reports that a joint statement intended to be released on Wednesday from all 28 member states was blocked by some countries, most notably Hungary, making it harder for the EU to claim it has a single position on the issue. And last week, the Czech Foreign Ministry said it would begin considering moving the Czech embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which many Israelis saw as an endorsement. Prague then later said it accepted Israeli sovereignty over West Jerusalem only. The biggest member states, France, Germany, Italy and the UK, have stuck to the same line in opposing Donald Trump's decision. President Mahmoud Abbas's declaration that the US has removed itself as a credible mediator between Palestinian representatives and Israel leaves a void to be filled, but it seems the EU is in no position to do so just yet.
Well, General Trancon, if we come to you first of all, the EU's foreign policy chief Federica Mogherini saying very clearly that the bloc's stance on this matter remains unchanged. They want to stay in line with international consensus on this.
Yes, of course, and that's the political position of the EU. But just remind everyone that the EU is of major importance for Israel. Is the first partner in commercial terms is EU with Israel. So that's why Mr. Netanyahu is coming there. It's very important. But on the second point, the political position of the EU is very difficult due to some country like Czech Republic or Hungary, who wants to recognize Jerusalem as the capital for Israel. But the rest of EU as a whole is just on the line of the UN resolution, which says that Jerusalem must be the capital of two states, and Palestine and Israel. And EU is also a major partner for Palestine.
I mean, let's come to you, Eugene Kontratrovich. The EU, they're saying today that they are in favour of the two-state solution. As far as you're concerned, what President Trump has done now, has he left any room open for a two-state solution?
As the president said, the two-state solution is always available if the parties want it. What we've seen actually for the past several decades is that the parties don't seem to want it, and that's why it hasn't been achieved. Mahmoud Abbas having turned it down, Arafat having turned it down. There's been a long series of no's. I think it's no less achievable than it was before, but to be honest, I think the general consensus is everyone understands it wasn't achievable before. The Middle East is on fire, the region is in turmoil, and the notion of creating a new state that can become an Iranian or other kind of client state in the region is, I think, absurd. I don't think this had any momentum before, and I think it would be hard to say Trump robbed this of some imminence that it previously possessed. This wasn't happening anyway.
Has this closed the door to a two-state solution for you, Nourodeh?
Well, of course not. Donald Trump does not have the authority nor the standing, nor does Israel, to rob the Palestinians of their choices and of their rights. The right of the Palestinian people to independence and sovereignty is absolute, and it is not up for negotiations. It's certainly not a present that we are begging from Israel. The two-state solution, like I said before, is the minimum that international law gave the Palestinians. And the Palestinians, more than any other party, are very interested in realizing sovereignty and independence, but not at any cost, not at the cost of their rights, of the principles of international law, or not at the cost of having a Mickey Mouse state. We're not talking about waiting to see what kind of, deal or what kind of offer Israel is going to throw our way, what kind of disconnected parts of our territory Israel is willing to let us control, and not even completely. The two states, as Palestinians and the rest of the world, except maybe now Trump, envision, are two viable states living side by side in security and mutual respect. That's the kind of two states Palestine seeks, and I think the international community is not just committed to that, it understands that peace in the region cannot be fully realized and stabilized without the Palestinians fulfilling those aspirations. Palestine's independence is not something that Palestinians ever put up on the negotiating table.
Greg
and it's
Colstrom,
not
what do you make of
up
the
to Israel
EU's
or
response
Trump to
today?
decide whether it's an option or not?
What do you make, Mr. Colstrom?
I think there's an irony here that President Trump, who claims to be the most pro-Israeli president to ever sit in the White House, may in the end up legitimizing talk of a binational state, the one-state solution, which is something that a majority of Israelis say they don't want. In the years that I spent reporting in Israel and Palestine, or a growing number of Palestinians that I spoke to, and certainly most of the young ones, people under, say, 35, feel exasperated with their leadership. They feel like the Palestinian national movement, in a lot of ways, has failed. Like you have an authoritarian, unpopular government in the West Bank, an authoritarian, unpopular government in Gaza, neither of which has done anything to advance the national cause or to bring the Palestinians any closer to statehood. And there are a lot of, again, particularly young people who say, you know, let's stop pushing for an independent state. Let's just give us Israeli passports. Let us work in Tel Aviv. Let us fly out of Ben Gurion Airport. Let's have some kind of a single state. And after Trump's decision, we heard from no less than Saeb Erekat, the lifelong chief Palestinian negotiator, a man who literally wrote a book called Life is Negotiations, who spent his entire life, really, working towards a two-state solution. He came out after President Trump's announcement and he said, you know what, the two-state solution has reached the end of the road. There's nothing to negotiate anymore. Let's talk about a binational state now. So again, I think it's ironic that President Trump, of all people, may actually bring this into the conversation.
Eugene Kontorovich, is a binational state something that, that Israel would accept?
The Palestinians have threatened calling for a binational state almost about as often as Mahmoud Abbas has threatened to resign or dissolve the Palestinian Authority. It's a threat they make every 6 months, and they don't do it. And there's a reason they don't do it, because Palestinians don't want to be citizens of Israel any more than I think Israelis probably want to have the
Would Israel accept a binational state?
Can you live in a binational state, Eugene? Can you handle having a state for all its citizens without the mentality of exclusivity and racism? Can you do that?
As a matter of Israel has a large Arab minority. It's the Palestinians who say they want a country only. Excuse me, I'm making an important point here.
Documented by no less than the State Department.
If the Palestinians are the ones who say we won't accept a state unless all the Jews are removed from it first. Jews have no problems with Arabs. It's the Palestinians who have the racist demand that any Jew in their state be removed before they are ready to take it. They want a state with no Jews.
Can we go one at a time? Is a war crime. This is not about Jews and Arabs. This is about Israeli settlers and settling illegally in Palestinian land.
Is a crime.
Don't mix your facts. No. This is about illegally residing, Israelis illegally residing in occupied territory, the state transferring illegally its citizens to occupied territory, and under the Rome Statute, you're a professor and you should know this, this is a war crime. This is not a matter
incidentally,
of dispute,
the notion that Jews living in Jerusalem is a war crime is ludicrous.
Don't tell me Jews and Arabs. This is not about nationality. This is about
Can we go one at a time? You raise a very good point there, because incidentally, ahead of going to Brussels today, Netanyahu was, of course, meeting with the French President Emmanuel Macron here in Paris. Emmanuel Macron saying very clearly that Israel needs to stop settlement building, and also reiterating his disapproval of Donald Trump's position. Eugene Kontorovich, can you respond to that before we come to you, Noor, and also to our two other guests?
The notion that Israel must prevent Jews from living, from buying properties, from building in land they have already owned and owned for centuries in the old city of Jerusalem is something so racist, so unprecedented. No country, I must say no occupying power, has ever been told to ban its people from territory under its control. This is a unique and bigoted demand. I'd like to see President Macron tell the King of Morocco not to allow Moroccans to live in Western Sahara, which the French consider occupied. I'd like to see Noor ask him that. These demands are made of no one but the Jews, and they're bigoted, racist, and unprecedented.
Okay, let's bring in Noor Day to respond to that.
Look, I don't like to get into religious dogma, and certainly let's get this out of the way. God is not a real estate agent. We're talking about international law and legality. We're not talking about Jews, Christians, and Muslims. We're talking about Israelis and Palestinians. Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory are illegal. They are a war crime under the Rome Statute, to which Palestine has acceded and to which France is a party. Those are legal facts. This has nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with feelings of racism. These are
no
facts.
Court
the
has ever said that this is a war crime.
has no right to transfer its citizens to the occupied territory. It is a war crime. I'm not debating that.
This is a crime that has never been invoked.
Now, if we're talking about land owned by people and the fact that they can't build on it, let's talk about Palestinians who still have the deeds to their land, who still have the deeds to their property, who are not allowed to build on their land. Let's talk about the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank who are not allowed to build on their property because Israel.
I'm just going to bring in General Trancon on this, because obviously as somebody who's worked with the military, what did you make of President Macron's comments yesterday? This reiteration he doesn't approve with Trump's decision, and also could France take on a role in this?
I don't think France can take a role on that, but the proposal made by President Macron to Netanyahu is interesting. He's saying, okay, President Trump has decided that it will be your capital. I will not recognize that because the UN doesn't recognize that, and France is at the Security Council a permanent member and will never say the country to what the Security Council say. But on the opposite, they say stop the settlement. And that's very important because, as the previous speaker was saying, the settlement in Israel currently is a major problem, because more and more ground is gained by Israel against the Palestine, which is an occupied part of Palestine. So that's why I think President Macron is just saying, okay, President Trump, I've given you a capital. I will not discuss that. I will not recognize that. But you make a step forward in the peace process. And I think that's very important.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of our debate. Greg Karlstrom, do you want to just come in with perhaps a final comment for us? Essentially what we need to take away from this debate and how it can move forward?
I think, again, to come back to an earlier point, nothing has changed on the ground, not just in the week since President Trump made this announcement, but really in the past decade. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been in office since 2009. Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, has been in power for more than a decade. All of the issues that plagued negotiations during the Bush administration or during the Obama administration, they're still there. We don't know what Jared Kushner is going to come out with in a few weeks or a few months when he unveils his peace plan. There's been some talk about bringing in regional countries, perhaps Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, trying to offer incentives for both the Israelis and the Palestinians to come towards a deal. But in the end, they still have to make a deal on these very difficult issues, settlements and borders and refugees and the status of Jerusalem, the issues that have plagued this debate for 25 years, and they have not been able to reach an agreement on. So I don't think President Trump's decision, in a way, I don't think it changed anything last week, because there was no peace process for him to derail.
Okay, Greg Karlstrom, you're the author of How Will Israel Survive? From Jerusalem. Eugene Kontrarovich, the Colette Policy Forum, joined us. Noor Odeh, former spokesperson for the Palestinian Authority, and Dominique Trancon, the former head of the French military mission to the UN. Thank you very much for your time, for speaking to us on France 24 today. Time now for Media Watch. Emma James joins us in the studio with a look at some of the media reactions to this diplomatic wrangling, if you will, over Donald Trump's decision to recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Yes, and it does seem as though across the world there are two headlines right now. One is that Benjamin Netanyahu has been urging the EU to fall into line with Donald Trump, or as The Guardian in the United Kingdom has gone with, Europe tells Netanyahu it rejects Trump's Jerusalem move. It really does seem to be very, very polarised throughout, regardless of whatever stage people are looking at this particular argument. Now, The Guardian, obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu would have been bolstered immensely by what Donald Trump decided to do and to make public. However, the first trip to the EU by an Israeli Prime Minister has somewhat had his parade rained on, shall we say, by plenty of leaders, including France's Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian, who said that the EU would not write a blank cheque for an unseen Trump peace plan, because that is fundamentally what nobody really understands right now. What is the plan for peace going forward? Is there a plan coming from the Trump administration? Now, online, quite a few people are sharing an old article from back in the summer. This was July the 19th of this year, where Benjamin Netanyahu was caught off guard and he was mic'd up making remarks to Eastern European leaders about the EU. Unbeknown to him, it was stopped fairly swiftly, but the remarks were being relayed via a set of headphones that had been given to reporters who were there, which is why we know what was said. And the reason people are sharing it now is really, I suppose, a bit of an explanation why there is unlikely to be a huge amount of movement between Benjamin Netanyahu and the European Union, because what he said then is that the EU's behaviour towards Israel is crazy. He berated the European Union basically for letting politics interfere with business. He didn't feel that politics should have any bearing on decisions on who does what deals with whom. I think Europe has to decide if it wants to live and thrive or if it wants to shrivel and disappear, was one of the remarks that he was heard making. He said that the European Union is reliant on Israel for both security and its future economy. Now, moving back to what's been said today, obviously a lot of people still very much focusing not so much on Europe but on Donald Trump's decision itself. Politico, among those on the side of the fence, thinking that this might be Armageddon, if you like. It's a very dramatic photograph they've chosen to use, an image of a burning American flag with a photograph of Donald Trump on it. And the headline says, "Don't be fooled by the muted reaction to Trump's Jerusalem gambit. It was an epic blunder," according to this writer, "that made peace far harder to achieve." Now, this particular writer goes on to say, Aaron David Miller penned this particular article. He says, "This Jerusalem gambit isn't a world ender. It's just ill-timed, ill-conceived, ill-considered, and unmoored from any real strategy that would advance US national interests, peace or security. Other than that, it's great," he says. Basically, his criticism is that it's all about domestic politics and presidential ego. A boneheaded move that has made a bad situation worse. However, not everybody thinks that there is that much impact to be made by this particular decision. The Washington Post has this opinion piece saying that it's a move without purpose. Contrary to the passionate advocates on both sides of the divide, those who see it as a masterstroke or a catastrophe, the Washington Post says, "We suggest it is less than meets the eye." They say that basically the White House should be more candid about why it's chosen to make this move now, saying that they should just admit this was a campaign promise and an irritant to Israel that Donald Trump simply wanted to remove, period. And they feel that if people were more straightforward, perhaps there wouldn't be quite such a fuss about it. But I think in the light of everything else that is happening in that region and that has ever happened before, the likelihood of this being swept under the carpet with, "Oh, it was just to fulfill a campaign promise," perhaps a little naive.
All right, Emma James with a roundup of what's happening online on Media Watch. Thank you very much indeed.